Well, thank you so much for inviting us to speak to you this evening on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the importance of reclaiming the vision of social and economic justice that's spelt out in it. As you said, we're going to be focusing predominantly on Article 25, which proclaims the right of everyone to an adequate standard of living. We're very much looking forward to presenting our ideas to you and to hopefully stimulating some discussion as well. My name's Victoria, and I'm going to be sharing the presenting with my colleague Adam, and we're from an organisation called Share the World's Resources, which is a campaigning group based in London that was founded by Mohammed Mesbahi in 2003 and has since gained consultative status at the Economic and Social Council at the United Nations. We make a case for integrating the principle of sharing into world affairs as a pragmatic solution to a broad range of world crises, such as hunger, poverty, climate change, environmental degradation, and conflict over the world's natural resources. We also advocate for an international programme of emergency relief to bring an end to poverty-related deaths as a top global priority. We'd like to make it clear right from the outset that we're not academics or economists, nor are we law experts. We are a campaigning group presenting a very holistic vision of international human rights law that we're hoping will stimulate your own thoughts and ideas. We're inviting you to think for yourselves around this issue and to really think outside of the box about how we can transform our world, not just by tweaking aspects of the current status quo, but by instigating a fundamental reorganisation of our current global economic systems and completely reimagining how we live together and share this planet in a sustainable way. We're going to present our ideas for about 30 or 40 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to a discussion and any questions or comments you may have afterwards. What we have to say might be quite a different approach from anything you've heard on this subject before, and we're offering it for your consideration. I'd also like to emphasise that the perspective that we hold is broad, holistic, and visionary. So we're thinking about the world and about humanity in all its wonderful diversity as one indivisible whole. So this concept of oneness isn't just some hopeful philosophy. It's actually backed up by many fields of scientific investigation, from really fascinating biological research right through to quantum physics. So from this understanding, our approach therefore begins from a truly global perspective about how we can address our interrelated crises, which are all fundamentally caused by the injustices built into our social, political, and economic systems. So we're going to talk about how we're going to need massive citizen engagement and participation in order to address our planetary crises that I've mentioned. And we're also going to talk about how we're going to need to change our entire perspective, or our consciousness even, on what it means to progress. Our governments have failed us again and again. Almost all social and environmental problems are worsening. So any lasting solution is going to have to come from all of us, ordinary people of goodwill. We don't see any alternative. The theme of this talk is centred around the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which, as I'm sure you are aware, was adopted in 1948 by the General Assembly at the United Nations. It's a remarkably simple and far-reaching document, and it forms the foundation of international human rights law. It's had an immeasurable impact on civil society, advocacy, and policy making, and has led to the rights-based approach to securing human well-being. However, it never promised to do anything more than promote or encourage respect for human rights, and without any explicit legal force. It does lay out a framework that can be used to exert pressure on governments that may violate any of its articles, but it was only ever a declaration and with no binding obligation on the behaviour of states. The International Bill of Human Rights was eventually agreed in 1966 by the General Assembly, and this comprised the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and its two main so-called implementing treaties, the International Covenant of Economic, Social and Cultural Rights and the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights. However, duties on member states still remain largely aspirational. Neither of these covenants has any real enforcement machinery other than requiring governments to submit periodic reports on measures taken. Extending the human rights approach into the domain of economic policy was a major development in the 20th century, but economic and social rights still remain by far the least fulfilled of all human rights. If you think, for example, of whenever you hear about human rights mentioned in the media, it nearly always tends to be in relation to civil and political rights. There have been much further advances in that area, as reflected in the work of organisations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. By comparison, economic and social rights have always been marginalised at the level of states and global institutions and never given any serious credence as part of the rule of law in international affairs. And this is why, as an organisation, we place a particular emphasis on Article 25, because that proclaims the right of everyone to an adequate standard of living, which in many ways is the essence of economic and social rights. And what we aim to demonstrate is that by implementing Article 25 into a set of binding domestic and international laws, this could have potentially dramatic implications for transforming our divided world. This is Article 25 in full. Everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and of his family, including food, clothing, housing and medical care and necessary social services, and the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age or other lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond his control. Motherhood and childhood are entitled to special care and assistance. All children, whether born in or out of wedlock, shall enjoy the same social protection. Before going any further, I'd like to invite you to take a few moments to imagine a world in which Article 25 has been fully implemented by every government. So just imagine that the basic rights of everyone are met. Everyone has somewhere to live, enough to eat, free healthcare. Have a think about how the world might look, how people might be spending their time differently, how you might be spending your time differently. Imagine the hope that millions of people who are currently living in dire poverty would be feeling for the first time. And how do you see Article 25 becoming a binding international law that's guaranteed by all governments? Start to think now about how we, humanity, could make that happen. You might want to hold this as a question in the back of your mind as you listen to the rest of our presentation. So let's have a look now at how far from this hopeful vision we are actually currently living in the world, in the context of the extent to which Article 25 is not fulfilled. Well, I think we're all familiar with rising levels of extreme inequality and poverty in the global north where we live. For example, there are 160,000 homeless households in Britain, and that figure's rising. And last year, over 1.3 million food parcels were handed out by the Trussell Trust alone, and that's not even counting many millions more handed out by hundreds of independent food banks and numerous other charities. And across the EU as a whole, 1 in 4 people are experiencing income poverty, severe material deprivation and or social exclusion. The UN has a special rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights, currently Philip Alston, who you may have heard about. And when any country drops below a certain level of poverty, then this can trigger a potential visit from him. And that's exactly what happened here in the UK last year. And he came in November for 2 weeks to investigate. And his report makes for really quite shocking reading. For example, he talked about the really cruel and devastating impact of the universal credit system, and also about how the costs of austerity have fallen disproportionately on women, on children, on ethnic minorities, and on people living with disabilities. What is equally shocking has been our government's response to the report. Every time they've been confronted with it, they have denied its validity, and they've been citing things like a strong economy and really high levels of employment as being evidence to prove that it just can't be right. And it just shows really how out of touch they are with the fact that people can even be working full time and still be living in poverty. Philip Alston also investigated in the United States the previous year, and his report there likewise discussed lots of situations of abject destitution that he witnessed whilst there. And he found that 40 million people are living in poverty there, with nearly half of them having incomes below half the poverty threshold, and a quarter of the youth are living in poverty. Having a look at the global south now, I think many of us are actually far less aware of quite how extraordinary and extreme the extent of hunger and poverty is there. There is a prevailing narrative that world poverty is decreasing, but that's measured from the World Bank's stated poverty line of living below $1.90 a day. Well, many academics and scholars have pointed out how completely impossible it is to live any kind of a life on that amount of money. And the UN have considered that in order to ensure the most basic level of survival, that figure should be at least $5 a day. And taking that figure instead as a more realistic poverty threshold, then we find that there are 4.3 billion people living on less than $5 a day. That's more than 60% of the global population. And that figure is increasing year on year, not decreasing. In fact, we are living through the biggest food security crises the world has ever known at the moment, with particular humanitarian emergencies in Yemen, in South Sudan, in Somalia and Nigeria. And this is at the same time as food is rotting away in storehouses in other parts of the world. Globally, it's estimated that 821 million people at the moment are suffering from chronic hunger, and 40,000 people a day are dying of starvation, malnutrition or other poverty-related causes as we speak. I find it very hard to imagine what it must be like watching your own children suffering from malnutrition or even starving to death. A friend of mine came back from Mexico with stories he heard whilst there of mothers living in poverty who would resort to boiling stones in a pan of water in order to try and calm down their hungry children, because they thought that must mean that food is coming. All of this is an affront to the very idea that everyone is entitled to an adequate standard of living. Clearly, Article 25 is not on the political agenda anywhere in the world. The growing crises of poverty and hunger are happening, of course, within the broader context of wars, of environmental destruction and climate change. And at the moment, there are more than 68 million people displaced due to conflicts, poverty and droughts, and that's the highest number ever on record. All of these planetary crises are interrelated, of course, and at the heart of all of them lies the non-fulfillment of Article 25, which I hope will become clearer as we continue. Adam.
Cheers. Okay, so what I would like to do is take a few minutes to firstly to emphasise the formidable obstacles that stand in the way of achieving economic and social rights of all peoples everywhere. And also I'd like to briefly touch on some of the reasons why our governments have failed to uphold these basic rights since the United Nations was founded. So for several decades, government policy has been guided by market-oriented strategies that directly exacerbate poverty and inequality. And this ideological approach to governance is often described as neoliberalism, which in its purest form has seen the market as kind of a cure-all for the ills of society. So private capital is essentially idolized as the means for creating endless economic growth and widespread social prosperity. One of the results is the increasing trends towards privatization in the provision of basic goods and services, alongside many other pro-corporate policies. There's a volume of evidence that demonstrates how this approach has undermined the welfare state and compromised the ability of governments to meet the needs of less privileged citizens who cannot afford the market price for things like housing, healthcare, education, utilities, and so on. On the international stage, the purely market-based approach to development has also been promoted by influential multilateral organizations like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. And these institutions have been widely maligned for pushing a one-size-fits-all ideology of free markets, privatization, financial deregulation, and social austerity, thereby limiting the role of governments in guiding development goals and providing public goods. The IMF in particular is harshly criticized for pushing targeted, means-tested social support for the poorest people, rather than a universal approach to social protection based on established human rights like Article 25. I'm sure many of you here may have heard of the structural adjustment programs that were introduced throughout the Global South in the 1980s and 90s, which have been described as one of the single largest causes of poverty following colonialism in the 20th century. Many developing countries were forced to prioritize loan repayments over funding essential services and to effectively abandon their commitment to redistributive policies or welfare services for low-income groups. And at the same time, the international trade regime is basically incompatible with human rights standards in many fundamental respects. This is particularly highlighted by the issue of so-called corporate courts, which has become a huge issue for many global justice campaigners now. Because most of the bilateral and regional trade agreements that are currently being negotiated give special legal rights to foreign investors to challenge the decisions of governments, even when those decisions are taken to meet social needs or pursue sustainable development objectives. So this is only an overview of a very complex picture, but when you put this together, it's very plain to see how little priority is given to the needs of the poorest and most vulnerable, especially on the international level. So the duty of states to respect and support the achievement of social economic rights outside of their borders it may be anchored in international law, but normative considerations of law and justice are overshadowed by strategic and ideological alignments among competing nation states. The leading actors in geopolitics do not even purport to represent the interests of the world as a whole. Instead, they primarily function on behalf of the dominant class within their own territorial space, giving the least concern to the situation and voices of disadvantaged groups in other countries. The United States is, above all, most notorious for its double standards. While it champions talk of human rights, it has historically rejected the idea that economic and social rights are full-fledged human rights at all, while officially pursuing policies that involve flagrant human rights abuses abroad. So hopefully this gives just a snapshot of the misguided priorities of the most powerful governments and international financial institutions, which often pursue agendas that are totally at odds with the simple vision spelled out in the Universal Declaration. There's a vast literature that examines all these issues, but what we're just attempting to make clear is the dramatic turnaround in policy and political attitudes that is needed if governments are to even begin to take seriously the full realization of their pledge as set forth in Article 25. So, what should most be emphasized is that we cannot implement Article 25 without also bringing about the fundamental economic and political conditions that are needed for the full enjoyment of such rights. So we have to ask how a poverty-stricken country in a region like sub-Saharan Africa can suddenly provide comprehensive public services and universal social protection for all without access to greater wealth and resources. Obviously, basic human needs cannot be met for the world as a whole without substantial coordination and assistance from the international community. The long-held aspiration of the United Nations to secure basic socio-economic rights for all can only be achieved if governments make a commitment to share resources more equitably, both within and between countries. And this is where we can draw a lot of inspiration from the long-forgotten Brandt Report from 1980, which was entitled North-South, a Programme for Survival. Hardly anyone talks about the Brandt Report any longer, but it remains one of the best-selling books on international development issues of all time. Compiled by an independent commission of respected world leaders that was chaired by Willy Brandt, the former German Chancellor. It gave a kind of a broad-based analysis of the critical state of the world while calling for major structural reforms to the international economic system. And at the heart of its recommendations was a call for a 5-year emergency program that would necessitate massive transfers of resources from the global north-south with the principal aim of eliminating hunger and extreme poverty as the highest political priority. Sadly, the political will to implement these measures was lacking in the early 1980s, and not since then have governments seriously considered ending poverty in a way that is commensurate with the vast scale of this ongoing emergency. Although some of Brandt's recommendations may be outdated after 40 years, the report still contains an inspired outline of what it means to render the implementation of Article 25 as a principal guide to political attitudes and global economic activity. It is now more urgent than ever that all nations commit to an extensive multilateral process through the United Nations, which would discuss the entire range of North-South issues. And as a campaign group, we've long argued that governments already have at their disposal all the financial resources, the capacity and technical knowledge that would be needed to prevent life-threatening deprivation in a relatively short span of years. But let's just pause for a moment and consider for ourselves the dramatic adjustments that must ensue if governments are to effectively implement Article 25 for all the world's people. So what would it mean for the current arrangements of the global economic system if socio-economic rights are fully translated into a set of binding, enforceable obligations through domestic and international laws, and if poverty is thereby essentially made illegal? And if we are truly inspired by Brandt's vision of a more equal and sustainable world, what kind of transformations will be necessary, be they social, political, economic, or otherwise, before we can ensure that everyone can live in dignity with the basics guaranteed? So here on this slide is just an illustration of some of the dramatic adjustments that must ensue if governments are to effectively implement Article 25 for all the world's people. Well, so we talked about the need for an emergency program along the lines of what the Brandt Commission proposed, but surely many other measures are called for in order to divert resources to critical human needs in the poorest countries and regions. For example, we can talk about an end to food speculation and the hoarding and destroying of food to affect market prices. the decommercialization of public services and the implementation of universal social protection programs, of course debt cancellation and the removal of all developing country debts, a rapid de-escalation of military activity, steep cuts in armament budgets, global measures for the prevention of tax avoidance and strengthened tax systems in the global south, and other methods of raising international revenues such as global taxation, as long discussed amongst progressive economists, things like global financial transaction taxes, a worldwide carbon tax, and so on. Even we have to talk about, of course, fairer trade rules and agreements in favour of the needs of poorer countries so that they no longer have such a detrimental impact on low and middle income countries, and that no longer impair governments' abilities to respect, protect and fulfil their human rights obligations. The simple point is that all of these kind of issues, which are like the bread and butter of many political activist groups, will inevitably come into play if governments are impelled to commit to rendering Article 25 into a truly universal and indivisible human right. And how about in the longer term, in terms of the repercussions of achieving Article 25? What we're really outlining here is the very beginnings of an entirely new paradigm in international relations based on a more equitable sharing of the world's resources. And above all, an international emergency program would lead to increased North-South cooperation with manifold implications such as the possibility of a binding UN climate treaty, drastic action to protect our environment, eventually the democratization, transformation and empowerment of the United Nations, of course a dramatic reduction in global terrorism, a mitigation of the global refugee and migration crises. We may even talk about the decrease and eventual stabilization of population levels, far from the nightmarish vision of 11 billion people or more inhabiting the planet by the end of the century. For there is enough evidence to suggest that population levels tend to stabilize when families and individuals are guaranteed an adequate standard of living. Even the definitive vision of a truly universal basic income may eventually come to pass, thus to ensure that everyone is guaranteed access to the essentials of life through an unconditional monetary transfer as a basic human right, a very topical issue right now, one that we've published a book about recently. So I'm actually trying to be as swift as I can here, believe it or not, because we could talk at great length around all those kind of issues. And I'm well aware of how utopian that line of argument may sound in our currently polarizing, chaotic social context. But what I hope that gets across is the tremendous potential of Article 25, however simply worded and unassuming, to revolutionize the unfair structures and rules of our unequal world. The ramifications go way beyond the thinking of establishment policymakers who usually propose changes within the existing political and economic paradigm rather than such a radical reimagining of intergovernmental relationships. So in the end, what all this depends on is the necessary implementation of the principle of sharing in world affairs, which will inevitably lead to such an altered and expanded outlook in human consciousness that we cannot even guess at the manifold positive results that may unfold at every level of society. And on that note, let me hand back to Victoria, who can talk a bit more about how this kind of vision may actually come about and what it may actually mean for us personally in our everyday lives and political activities.
Thank you. Yes, so having outlined the case for implementing Article 25, that is the remaining question: how are we going to make it happen? Well, given that it doesn't look like governments are about to wake up to reality on their own, in fact they seem more beholden to serving the financial interests of powerful corporations rather than the needs of their own people, and divine intervention notwithstanding, we suggest it's only going to come about through the massed goodwill of ordinary people with a united call for Article 25 through enormous, continuous, peaceful demonstrations around the world. People power should not be underestimated. Can we imagine what an impact millions of people would have if we stood behind one single idea? Article 25 is a unifying idea. It's such a simple statement of basic rights and so easily understood that it could appeal to very broad swathes of the general public who might not even usually consider themselves to be politically engaged. It's also a unifying vision in that it's not against or anti anything, but at its core, at its heart, it is for absolutely everybody. So it could bring together rich and poor alike. So even the most wealthy are likely to agree that we should all have access to the very basics in life. And it would certainly appeal to those living in extreme poverty who are struggling to survive. It would have a meaning and an immediate relevance to them in a way that perhaps other global concerns and campaigns might not do. Article 25 is the key to resolving so many of the world's problems. It has embedded within it many of the demands of bygone activists throughout history up to the present day. I have personally been politically active since 9/11. That's what first woke me up to global politics. And since then I've been involved in all sorts of campaigns and demonstrations relating to various issues of social and environmental justice. All of them fundamentally interconnected, of course. And I'd been thinking increasingly over the years that we need to find some way of weaving them all together to have a stronger voice. And that's why I was so excited to come across this campaign for Article 25, because it does exactly that. It has so many implications incorporated within it, some of which Adam outlined. And it's not like we're creating something new here. It's already in existence, enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, just waiting in the wings to come to fruition. But are global demonstrations even possible? Well, we've seen activist movements over recent years that have spread very quickly from one country to the next. For example, Occupy and Nuit Debout, although they weren't sustained for long enough to achieve their desired results. But we have seen how protest can work when it's sustained for long enough to see it through. For example, the suffragette movement here in the UK and the civil rights movement in America. There was a film in 2014 entitled We Are Many. I don't know if any of you have seen that. It explores the global protests against the war in Iraq in 2003. And many of the commentators in the film talked about how the protests really should have been continuous rather than for just one day. Share the World's Resources has produced a book on Article 25 that very compellingly explains why it's only continuous protest that is going to achieve the end goal. The main argument of the book is this: only through uniting ordinary people on a global level with an informed mind and a compassionate heart that asks, what about the others, can we shift the priorities of our governments. We see such ongoing protests as being truly global, like nothing that has gone before, based on one simple and benevolent cause. This would be a new approach to activism and movement building. Our world has never been in such a critical state before, and it's going to take a change of consciousness, a change of heart even, and the mobilization of millions to transform it. Now, we're not suggesting that people who are already involved in all kinds of really vital campaigns should be doing anything differently, other than to also embrace demanding Article 25 alongside their current activities. The chances are that having Article 25 in place would be of direct or indirect benefit to those campaigns anyway. But we need to build a voice that is loud enough and sustained enough that no government can ignore us. We need to herald one unifying demand that can transcend all our political differences. And boy, do we have a lot of those at the moment. But that can transcend all those differences in the most inclusive way. And Article 25 can do that. It is such a demand. If you feel inspired by what you're hearing this evening and would like to get involved, then why not come on demonstrations with us? We have a global call for sharing there. We're collecting email addresses, and there are a couple of boxes at the end you can tick if you would like to receive our mail out, or if you'd like to come on demonstrations when we go. We also have these posters and postcards which you're very welcome to take and share with others. And also please do let us know if you can think of any other groups that might be interested in hearing these ideas. I'd like to draw the presentation part of the evening to a close now by asking a few more questions of ourselves and our responsibilities towards the world that we live in. Any of us can talk about world problems. We can write books and papers on it. We can come up with brilliant ideas. We can have conferences, give talks like this one. But how can we make all our proposals a reality? Where actually lies the hope for bringing about the lasting changes that we need to create the just and sustainable world that we all want to live in? And for how much longer can we watch people dying from hunger in a world of plenty without taking action? Just relying on our governments alone to do the right thing leaves us complacent to the suffering that's all around us. But if we could really and truly understand that the suffering of other people is also our own suffering, that nothing actually separates us from the other, then perhaps we would act differently. The world is an interconnected, living being, and if one part of it is sick, then that is eventually going to affect the rest of the world. We can see this really clearly with climate change, and with the mass movement of economic migrants from poor countries and the recent influx of refugees into Europe.